just tell you a couple of things that are going on right now. Who was it who brought up? Yeah, you brought up the global warming thing. Well, it was 9-10 years ago. It all started with a thing called a treaty called the Kyoto Treaty, and that treaty was what they wanted us. It was during the Clinton-Gore days, and they were going to bring that treaty up. They never submitted it for ratification because they knew they didn't have the votes. But then right after that, we had everybody introducing bills for cap and trade. And they were all Democrats. McCain was the biggest mover of that thing. John McCain, McCain-Lieberman bill would be a bill for cap and trade. Now, what cap and trade is, and the reason at that time Republicans were a majority, I chaired a committee called the Environment and Public Works that had jurisdiction over the Environmental Protection Agency. So what I did at that time, I thought everybody said that all this devastating global warming was coming, and it's all because of CO2 and all these emissions. I assumed that was true because everybody said it was. And then we found out, of course, when we found out what it would cost, the Wharton School of Economics did a study, and they said if we were to pass cap and trade in the United States of America, the cost would be between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, what I do, because I'm not as smart as the rest of these guys up there, every time we hear an amount, I take the total number of families in Oklahoma that file tax returns, and I do the math. That would have cost us, each one of you, who the average, who pays taxes for your family, $3,100 a year. Now, what do you get for it? You get nothing for it, because by their own admission, if we were to try to regulate CO2 in this country, it wouldn't have anything to do with worldwide emissions. In fact, it would increase it, because as we chase our manufacturing base out of America and it goes overseas, it's going to go to places like China and India and Mexico, places where they don't have that regulation. They don't have to regulate the emissions. So it would actually have the effect of increasing. Then we found out from the different scientists that it isn't really a pollutant. You can't grow anything. You can't grow anything anywhere near Alva, Oklahoma, if you don't have CO2, because it's necessary. Well, anyway, back in 2003, when they had the McCain-Lieberman bill, I said it's the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. And it would have been, because I can remember back, and this is going to sound more partisan than it's meaning to be, but forget about your registration here in Alva, Oklahoma, and think about what it is in Washington. In Washington, the backbone, the financial backbone of the Democratic Party has always been traditionally it was the labor unions. Then after that, it became the trial lawyers. But for the last 8 or 9 years, it's clearly been, it's hard to explain to people because it's not so visible as the other two. It's been the far left environmentalists. I'm talking about MoveOn.org, George Soros, Michael Moore, the old Al Gore group, and Hollywood, and all of them that try to overregulate this country. And the far left environmentalists, they want to run everybody else's life, and they have huge amounts of money. So if there are questions on that, I'll be glad to answer in just a minute. But I just want to mention to you that I stayed with that, and I was the one bad guy because nobody else would touch that issue. I remember when Newt Gingrich, supposed to be this great conservative, I remember Newt Gingrich sitting on the couch with Nancy Pelosi holding hands and talking about how we're going to have to do something about global warming. You might have seen that on TV. And so anyway, we've won that. We killed all the bills. And so our president says, all right, if we're not going to pass legislation, we're going to do it through regulation, through the Environmental Protection Agency. And that's what they're attempting to do right now. To do that, they had to have what they call an endangerment finding, then go back and start regulating. And it's not, if you're in the ag business, you think you're targeted, or if you're in the energy business, you think you're targeted. If you're in the manufacturing business, you're all targeted, because that's what we're facing with right now. And the reason I wanted to start right off with that is because this gentleman right here made a good point. He said, people, they know about deficits and debt and all that, but they don't know the cost of regulations. They don't know the taxes we have to pay for over-regulation. And right now, without getting too technical, we have not just the cap and trade they're trying to do, but all these things. In fact, they were regulating dust. They were going to regulate dust. And I had a news conference just south of Altus, and I had this is really neat, a big turnout. We had people there from Washington who had never been west of the Mississippi and out down there, and I said, all right, it's a very short news conference. I said, this is the whole thing. This stuff down here, it's kind of the color of this carpet. That's dirt. Now, this little round circle here that's green, that's cotton. Now, put your finger up here, that's wind. Are there any questions? But there is no technology that will stop dust. And we won, I think mostly as a result of that news conference. It got good attention. But it's over-regulation in our society. The cost to it is just unbearable. Now, the second thing I'm going to complain about is the president and the debt. I never believed, I can remember back in 1995 when Clinton came out with his budget for fiscal year 1996, and it was $1.5 trillion. Now, I went down to the Senate floor and I said, this is outrageous. That, we can't sustain this thing. This last budget of Obama, the deficit alone was more than the entire budget in 1996 to run the whole United States of America. So we're talking about, and I don't know why the media is, they won't, it'd be so easy just to answer the question and say, my gosh, he has accumulated more debt in 2 years now. He's only been 2 years with a House and a Senate that did anything that he wanted. At that time, he accumulated $3 trillion in deficit and more debt than had been accumulated in 230 years, all the time between George Washington and George W. Bush. Now, that's one man did that. And it's a man who just is, every institution that's made America different than other countries, he is doing. I know it sounds critical. I say the same thing on the Senate floor. This guy's killing us. But in a way, I might be in Alva, Oklahoma 5 years from now, and we'll look back and say that's the best thing that could have happened to America. That America needed a shock treatment that puts government above people. And this is the first time in this country that's happened. And that's what we're faced with now. So on the debt and the deficit and the spending, it's just unbelievable that what is happening. I'm using a checklist here, and you've got this, so you won't have to take notes. Isn't that nice of me?
Oh, yes. I appreciate you.
Okay, we have the Inhofe-Upton bill right now. We lost it. What we tried to do is I had an amendment that would have taken the jurisdiction away from the EPA to regulate the greenhouse gases. And we weren't able to do it. It did pass the House, of course. So just recently, I want to mention one thing. This is something I wasn't going to mention, but I'm going to have to because it's on a lot of the media right now. I've had a thing in Africa for quite some time. It started out as a mission, more of a Jesus thing. Then after 9/11, I decided that wisely, the Senate Armed Services Committee that I'm on the second-ranking member of, they decided that they would start looking toward Africa to help them as a squeeze takes place in the Middle East. The terrorism's going down through Djibouti and the Horn of Africa and spreading out down there. So we decided we would help the Africans build 5 African brigades. And since I was the only member of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee who knew where Africa was, I took it on. So I'm there quite a bit. And in fact, that's where we adopted this little girl who was almost dead. Anyway, I say that because recently in the news there's been a lot about Cote d'Ivoire. Now we hear a lot about Libya, and they all know about that, but nobody's really following what's going on in a West African country called Cote d'Ivoire. And what has happened was there is a president there by the name of Laurent Gbagbo, his wife Simone. I've known him forever. And the French, they're the bad guys in Africa. They took over and rigged an election to knock him out of office. And then he refused to relinquish it. And then finally they caught him, and they're torturing him as we speak. But anyway, if you hear anything, or if anyone knows about that, I'd be glad to respond to any questions. So what I've been spending more time on than anything else is the 2 committees that I have. One's Environment and Public Works, and then the other is Armed Services. Now, during the 90s, that was during the Clinton years, there was a drawdown of some 40% in our military. The euphoric chant at that time was the Cold War is over, we no longer need a military. And so they drew down the military. Then, of course, Bush got in office, and then 9/11 came. Well, all of a sudden, we were faced with the war really on 2 fronts, with a military that's been drawn down to by 40%. So he had to start trying to rebuild the military at the same time, doing what's necessary in those 2 fronts. And it's been a very difficult thing to do. I know that there's not a person in here who doesn't know someone who's with the 45th or with the Guard or the Reserve, and what they have done is, I think, they've overworked the Guard and Reserve. The whole idea of the Guard and Reserve is that people can be soldiers, and then that when called upon, they could, be where they have to be. But we've been so reliant upon them that many of these guys are on their third and fourth deployment, and they can't continue to do it. So that's a serious problem, and we can't rebuild the military right now because of the guy who's in the White House. His last budget is a huge budget. I hope somebody asks about it. I have all the details on this thing. What he's done is raise the cost of government just atrociously. The only area that he has cut is military. Now, this is true. Liberals don't believe you need a military. Liberals, honestly, in their heart, believe that if everybody stands in a circle and holds hands and unilaterally disarms, then all the threats will go away. So that's kind of what we are dealing with right now. And again, that's going to come to a halt. We saw what happened in the 2010 elections. For those of you who think that this country would be better served by having Republicans take the Senate, I'm sure it's going to happen in 2012. And there's not one Democrat serving in the Senate who won't agree with that they're going to lose control of the Senate. It's very simple, and that's the reason that a lot of them are starting to vote much more conservatively, because they know their days are numbered. There are 23 Democrats coming up for re-election in 2012, and of that, 15 of them are endangered species, and 3 have already retired because they know that, number one, either they couldn't hold on to their seat, or if they did, they would be a minority, and that's not much fun. So you're seeing help is on its way. That's what I'm trying to say. Let's see. Why don't we just open it up, and anything you want to talk about, we will, and I'll get back where I'm supposed to stand in just a minute. I do want to mention 2 things. These are in your handouts, these 2 handouts. This is the required reading. I came all the way out here. You got to read it, okay? One of them is having to do with the... Oh, these are a couple articles that I wrote that I think would be, I've talked about fiscal restraint. But here's one where I'm going to lose some of you guys. I know I am, and you're going to be probably too polite to hold your hand out, but there are going to be a lot of people who bought into this idea that the conservatives had on what they called earmarks. Earmarks are defined as appropriations. The Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, says Congress is supposed to do the spending. It's not the president, it's Congress. And for those people who they read off these lists of these ridiculous things, which you can attack and defeat, but by doing away with what they call and giving a moratorium, which the Republicans did on earmarks, means that goes to the President of the United States. Why do you think the number one goal of Barack Obama was to have the Republicans have a moratorium on earmarks? It's mind-boggling, and I know a lot of you don't believe this, but I was the only conservative Republican who voted against it and said this is the worst mistake that we can make. And I think people now realize those individuals who got elected because they saying they're going to do away with earmarks, as soon as they got in office, said, well, wait a minute, I wasn't talking about transportation. Well, I wasn't talking. These are the things that we are supposed to be doing because we know more about the needs of our cities. Let me give you an example. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. In the last budget, the president, in his budget, the president sends the budget to Congress. Then the Congress changes it or approves parts of it. Part of this in the defense budget was $330 million that went toward a rocket system. It's a good system. It's called a bucket of rockets. Except when you look at the scarce dollars, we decided in the Senate Armed Services Committee that we, instead of using that money for that, we would buy 5 new F-18s. Well, that is an earmark then. That's what Congress did. And so that now is something that they can't do. And so that has to go back, and the president calls all the shots. It goes back, whether it's the Department of Interior, the DOD, it just gives him all this power.